Why did Nerf Nitro only last 2 years? What was good about it, and could it have seen a resurgence had they just held on a little bit longer due to some wildly unforeseen circumstances? So let's wind the clock back to 2017 when Nerf Nitro first released. Let's talk about it. If you're not familiar with Nerf Nitro, think of it as Hot Wheels cars but foam, and they come with their own launchers that look suspiciously like blasters. First, just a tiny bit of a history lesson. Nerf, of course, isn't just known for blasters. There's also very few instances where Nerf got into toys more in general. Way back in the initial Nerf days, there were things like Nerf critters, Nerf trains, all kinds of just weird stuff that was foam-based but not necessarily projectile-based. And the fact that some of those Nerf critters had wheels makes me think that the Nitro stuff takes some inspiration. I wouldn't say a whole lot, but just some inspiration of expanding the definition of Nerf and using the foam in unexpected places. So back to a little more of a modern era, 2017 came around, and the previous year at Toy Fair, Nerf announced Nerf Nitro. There was a big splash for this, tons of news articles. One in Wired specifically mentions things like Dude Perfect, doing Nerf trick shots and things like that, where that wasn't really the intended use of Nerf blasters. So they came up with a series of vehicles, cars in this instance, that could then be used for tricks. But to get those cars moving, they didn't use a traditional launcher or a track like Hot Wheels. No, they leaned into the blaster design of Nerf blasters. And this is called the Double Clutch Inferno. This is one of the later entries into the Nitro series, but it's the closest one that I had when talking about this video. And I think it highlights some pretty interesting things for the Nitro line. See, this was the method to get the cars moving quickly. And as soon as it left this ramp right here, the cars had free range to do whatever you wanted. It was unstructured, open-ended play when it came to what happened after the initial launch. Going back to that news article from Wired.com, some of the people at Hasbro were talking about how they didn't want to include tracks like you would think with Hot Wheels or with any other car-based toy, because it was just extra setup and storage of it was a problem. And while I can see that being a real reason, I'm also thinking because they were selling these launcher/blasters, this was something difficult to store as well. I mean, as somebody who collects hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Nerf blasters, storage can be a problem. Even though there weren't any tracks, that doesn't mean accessories weren't a thing. In fact, accessories were a big deal for the Nerf Nitro line. You have things like these rings of fire that you could try to jump your car through. You had ramps that you could set up and launch your cars off of. There were all kinds of cones and barrels that you could set up in patterns to create obstacles for your Nitro cars. And even though there wasn't a dedicated track that your cars would be guided along, the launcher could be pointed towards all of these obstacles, all these accessories, so that you could create your own story. And the reason that this is okay to do, it all comes down to the construction of these cars. The main body of the car is a denser foam. Think of something that you would find in some of the Nerf melee weapons at the time, specifically like Enforce style stuff. There were some compromises though, because there does need to be some plastic with this to keep it structured, to keep it shaped, to keep it moving in a relatively straight direction. And the areas that are plastic are the wheels right here. So all four wheels are plastic, as well as the underneath chassis of this. It gives it some nice structure and some stability. I imagine because over time, if you had the axles going through the foam, it would start to tear and buckle and bend the foam in ways that would make these cars basically unusable. With those plastic bits in mind, the foam construction was built in a way so that there'd be buffer zones. As long as you weren't just throwing these wheels first at a wall, it would always hit a foam piece before anything else. Let's launch a few of these, shall we? And we'll use this blaster right here. You have to pull back on it. It opens this door. I can load up to 2 cars at a time, which I think I'll do because that's kind of fun. We'll do a red versus blue match here. Now, it's not really going to be a race because I'm going to be firing them off into the distance. It'll be more like a grenade launcher than a car launcher, but you'll get the idea of how these things work. Now, once I press these down, everything is primed and loaded. Primed and loaded. If I were just to squeeze the trigger, it's going to lock up. The reason for that is because this square button at the bottom is how you unlock the trigger, because they want you placing this down on a flat surface. I don't know, these cars are very hard to find nowadays, but it's just a safety mechanism so that you're using it for the most intended purposes. You can use the palm of our other hand to bypass that and fire them. So you get an idea of just how fast these things fly out. The launcher does do a good job of getting these going quickly, but I think what we need to do now is set up a track on the ground and use these in their intended ways. Pretty cool, right? I mean, Nerf Nitro had some great ideas. Which begs the question, why did it only last until about 2019? That means it was only in production for roughly 2 years. Was it prematurely canceled? Because I think there's a case where Nerf Nitro could come back and be pretty cool. Was it canceled a little too prematurely because of some recent social media trends that made car races and car stunts extremely popular on platforms like TikTok? One thing that I think Nerf Nitro does exceptionally well is create something new within the car category. For years, it's been dominated by things like Matchbox, Micro Machines, Hot Wheels, and it was always a difficult thing to move away from that type of car toy. Nerf Nitro upends those rules somewhat by making a mostly foam car and ditching tracks entirely. No playsets, no nothing like that, just pure accessories, obstacles, and launchers. But while it's great to be different and make something new, it didn't necessarily play well or be all that compatible with other toy car systems. And when you think about leaders in the toy car space, Hot Wheels is inevitably the monster that comes up as the thing to beat. So by not recognizing the 800-pound gorilla in the room, definitely set Nerf Nitro a little bit behind. And another reason why I think Nerf Nitro didn't last too terribly long in production is the fact that it was maybe a little too open-ended. I do agree with the sentiment that tracks and playsets are a little hard to set up and take down and store, but what it does do really well is contain the mess. Nerf Nitro, in theory, if you're playing it the way that it's somewhat intended, you should be firing these everywhere and anywhere. It means there could possibly be more cleanup or more hunting for the foam cars. But if you're familiar with Nerf, then you know that hunting for foam things is just kind of part of the game. And the last reason that it probably didn't last as long as it could have is the price. It was more expensive to buy the cars, it was more expensive to buy the launchers, because in a sense you had to buy a launcher with a car. You could manually just run the car up a ramp, but it's not going to have the same feel, it's not going to have the same power, the same pop, the same effect as if you were using one of the Nerf Nitro launchers. I mean, it's the difference between this and this. It's hard to be a challenger in an entrenched toy category, and Nerf should be all too familiar with that because they own most of the blaster space on store shelves. Yes, other companies and competitors have made gains, but Nerf is still really the behemoth. So when it came to the foam cars, I think there might have been a little bit of underestimating with this product. Was Nerf Nitro canceled too quickly? I think that's something that we can take a look at, and I'm sure they have a lot of sales data to back up the fact that, okay, the 2-year lifespan of this, it ran its course. But what they didn't foresee, and what nobody could have foreseen, is that after 2019, the whole world looked a whole lot differently. And one of the early things that really caught on within TikTok that I remember seeing as I was posting Nerf content was car races using Hot Wheels cars. There were creators that grew massive million-plus followings that all followed along their car races using the Hot Wheels tracks. And I know this might not make sense to people who don't necessarily remember or were on that side of TikTok when it was happening, but those car races were something that people got excited to see every day. There were tournaments structured and all this kind of stuff. And I think there could have been a spot for Nerf Nitro had those products kept releasing. Ended up happening is all the Nerf Nitro stuff started going away, and it was getting harder and harder to find. And it hasn't been until recently that the Nerf Nitro finds at thrift stores, garage sales, and things like that have included cars. For the longest time, I would see just the launchers, but the cars were always so elusive. Thankfully, Ollie's Discount Store was selling 4-packs of the cars for $4. And considering the original price of those cars, that was a really great deal. And of course, as luck would have it, I started then finding more and more cars in the bag sections at Goodwills. So would Nerf Nitro have had a resurgence when everybody was in lockdown? It's hard to know, but it seems like the case could certainly be made. And if we talk about like right now, if Nerf Nitro could have a resurgence, I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's right now going to be one of those nostalgic memories for a lot of people when we get 5-10 years down the road. And interestingly enough, the cars that I find are often in good shape, unlike Nerf footballs and other Nerf products that aren't blasters and foam darts. These don't have like bites or teeth marks or anything like that chewed into them. These were well-loved toys, but they're still holding their shape, still holding the paint fairly well. And what I know of Nerf Nitro, looking at it now, years after the initial production runs are over, it's high-quality stuff. So what do you say, let's get a little closer look at some of the Nerf Nitro stuff, and then we'll close out the video. Everything I know about Nerf Nitro. And hopefully it answered a little bit of the question of whether it was justifiably canceled, what kind of good ideas that it had behind it, as well as if it could have made a resurgence had they just held on a little bit longer. And if you like Nerf blasters, if you like action figures, if you like just toys in general, be sure to follow along, help the channel grow, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.